Okay, hello and a very good morning to everyone. We will start today's first session, and our first two presentations will talk about the Estonian archives in Australia and about the first part of the archives, or how the archives in Australia was born. The topic will be presented by Mr. Inno Salasoo.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I'm Inno Salasoo, born in Tartu, grown up on Nõmme, then spent over 4 years in Germany, and almost 70 years in Australia. In Australia, I went to a college which later became a university. I studied chemistry. Eventually, I obtained the doctorate in organic chemistry, worked at that field, and I'm also active in the Estonian Lutheran St. Church congregation in Sydney, and what's more, I have even substituted the pastor when necessary on several occasions. Anyway, here today I want to talk about the Estonian archives in Australia, the first 40 odd years. Well, for a start, I remind you that when looking back in history, all steps taken must be judged in the light of what the world situation was at that time. Well, the Council of Estonian Societies in Australia was formed in January 1952. At the same meeting, it was decided to establish Estonian archives in Australia. At first, it was intended to collect materials about all Baltic nations, but before long it was realized that this would exceed our capacity. So it was decided to limit our efforts to matters concerning Estonians. During the first 12 months, several people were trusted with getting the archives going. But a year later, on January 8, 1953, the job was given to my father, Dr. Hugo Salasoo, and he took it on himself, and he looked after the archives for 38 years. By profession, he was a pharmacist, doctor of pharmacy, and well, I would point out that in the late 20s and early 30s, there were only 2 universities in Europe that offered the degree of a doctor of pharmacy. These 2 were Tartu and Budapest. Right. So as a pharmacist, he had to improvise the running of the archives. So he kept this for 38 years, and it should be noted that he received no remuneration for it. On January 8, 1991, at the age of 89 years, he handed it over to me. These archives were to serve several purposes. Firstly, to collect and save data about the life of Estonians in Australia. Secondly, and more importantly, to collect and store evidence that Estonians as an ethnic and cultural group have existed for centuries, that there has been an independent country named Estonia, and that Estonians abroad carry on the Estonian culture while Estonia is occupied by Russia. It was clear that the Soviet Union was just a smoke screen for the centuries-old Russian imperialism, which tried to wipe Estonia as a country and Estonia as a nation and ethnic identity from the world. In other words, the archives were to collect and save proof that Estonia as a nation and Estonia as an independent country have existed and are continuing to exist, even though the country is occupied by a foreign force with genocidal intents. Third aim was to collect and save printed material published in the free world in Estonian language, as well as about Estonia or Estonians, or written by Estonians in any language. Fourthly, to collect and save photos, films, and recorded sound materials of Estonians and their activities. And occasionally other items came to the archives. One of them was in 1980, when I was in Stockholm. Then I was given, in order to pass it on to our archives, a pocket watch, old-fashioned pocket watch with a dented cover. The man, soldier, had this in his pocket, and the bullet came there and dented the cover and saved his life. And his wish was, when he had handed it in to some archivists in Stockholm, that it should be sent and kept as far from Estonia as possible. So it was given to me, and I passed it on to the Estonian archives in Australia. Right, and also the Estonian archives collected copies and memories, and copies of memories and personal correspondence, and it could be kept confidential in a closed fund until a predetermined date. So the establishment of and the aims of Estonian archives in Australia were announced in Estonian media throughout the free world. All publishers of newspapers, magazines, and books were requested to send free copies of their products to the archives. Individuals were requested to send newspaper cuttings about Estonians or Estonia. And if anybody, including those who had left Estonia before the World War II and gone to Australia, if any of them had books, magazines, or papers that they had brought with them, and if they didn't want them any longer, they were asked to give these to the archives. Well, the response was encouraging. Materials of all kinds began arriving. Initially, the address of the archives was a Sydney Estonian House. When Hugo Salasoo took care of the archives, it comprised about 90 books and a few copies of newspapers and magazines. These were kept in the Estonian House in a locker in a storeroom under the stage. When the Estonian House was reconstructed and enlarged in 1958, a room meant for the archives was found to be no larger than a broom cupboard. Consequently, the archives materials were placed in a large cupboard in a room used by the Saturday school. But soon even this was insufficient. Then Hugo Salasoo took the materials to his home, a weatherboard single-family dwelling at Lidcombe, 18 kilometers west of Sydney Centre. In a bedroom, he installed shelves and cupboards for the archives. The space shortage was temporarily overcome, but the danger of fire in an about 70 years old weatherboard dwelling remained. By the mid-1960s, that room was packed to the ceiling, but more materials kept coming. The owner of the archives, the Council of Estonian Societies, had no funds to provide more secure and suitable rooms. Therefore, Dr. Hugo Salasoo, after reaching retiring age in 1967, used his pension funds to erect a special light-proof and moisture-proof building of the archives for the archives in his backyard. Local government regulations limited the size to 25 square meters. This building, completed in May 1968, housed the archives for 2 decades at a nominal rent of $8 per week. By 1990, even its capacity was insufficient. The Council of Estonian Societies formed an archives committee to consider the future accommodation. The possible solution to transfer the archive holdings to a university library was excluded because experience elsewhere showed that anything in the libraries that hadn't been looked at for 1 year was thrown out, for the libraries too suffered a shortage of space. Finally, a section of the Sydney Estonian House was adapted to accommodate the Estonian archives. The archive holdings were transferred from Litcom to the Estonian House in June 1994. Well, while the archivists Hugo Salasoo tried to collect in the archives all books, periodicals, and other printed materials in Estonian language published in the free world after 1944. In addition, the archive received and preserved Estonian books, magazines, newspapers, and so on from the independence and pre-independence days, if anything like this was available from aging Estonians. From 1962, he compiled annual reports of the archives holdings. These reports he sent to contributors all over the world, and he enclosed one to his relatives in Tartu. This report found its way to the library of Tartu University. As a result, there developed an exchange of books. Hugo Salasoo sent to Tartu books published in exile, one by one, and received books from the years up to 1939. Of course, the books he sent to Estonia were placed in closed funds, accessible just a selected few. The books he received were taken from lists decreed to be destroyed and were sent to Australia for safekeeping. Their arrival in Australia increased the significance of the Estonian archives holdings as proof of Estonian culture having existed already some time ago. Annual reports continued until Hugo Salasoo retired from the archives in January 1991, and further I continued with the reports until the end of 1993. The last report at the end of 1993 said that at that time the archives contained 8,443 books and booklets in Estonian, including 4,015 published before 1944, and therefore 328 books from before 1900, the oldest one from 1697. In other languages and bilingual, there were 15,723 books and booklets, including 641 published before 1944, and therein 109 books from before 1900, the oldest one from 1687. There were 53,725 programs, leaflets, newspaper cuttings, and other minor printed items. Estonian periodicals, there were 256 titles from before 1944 and 533 titles from outside Estonia after 1944. Periodicals in other languages containing articles written by Estonians and containing articles concerning Estonians or Estonia were 884 titles. There were 12,450 scientific papers from 793 Estonian scientists in the free world. There were about 1,600 files from organizations and individuals, over 28,300 photos, negatives, and slides. There were also ex libris, audio and video recordings, films, documents, manuscripts, memoirs, and much else. Estonian archives in Australia contain materials in 46 languages. A detailed description of the archives from the beginning to 1987, compiled by Hugo Salasoo in Estonian, was published in the collection Eestlased Austraalias 1, pages 147 to 166. A lecture on the Estonian archives in 1952 to 1988 was given at the ARPS conference at Baltimore in 1988. As a memorial to Hugo Salasoo's 38 years of dedicated work with the Estonian archives in Australia, I arranged at my expense for Eesti TV personnel to film the archives in November 1993. 2 of the resulting 6 programs were broadcast in December 1993. The others followed the next year. Well, thank you for listening to the story of the Estonian archives in Australia from January 1952 to June 1944. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the time for questions and comments. Just wipe your hand and please let's use the chance. Or Australia seems to be so far away that no questions. Okay, luckily you have one.
From an Australian, you know that the archives now occupies one big room at the front of Estonian House over the shop. And we have a workroom which is shared with the language schools. So how does that space and the material that it can hold compared with the space that you had when you handed over the archives after 40 years after they began? Did you have more space in the Estonian House in Australia?
I don't know about this. I think our next speaker will tell you all about this, because I don't know what happened later.
Some more comments? Or okay, thank you very much, Inno Salasoo. And now let's move on to the second part of the Estonian archives story in Australia. And we warmly welcome Maia Barrow, the nowadays keeper of the archives.
Ole ja tulette meille, kuidas se käib. Kun mä tahan ma tahan jätta seda momendiks. Nii et esimene slaid, kuidas ma esimese slaidi üles saan.
Üks hetk, jah, kohe vaatame, kus sul on see.
See siin. Ja kui ma tahan ta käima panna, mida ma surun? F5. Okei, ja edasi? Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see that there are two of us from Australia talking and one asking questions, because we are a little disappointed that in this lovely slide, whoops, wrong one. I want to go back one. How do I go? Oh, that was it. Eelmise peale. Never mind, it'll do, leave it. Nii et see täiuslikult on täiussuuruses sellega.
Yeah.
On the lovely logo that we have with the flags and the map of the country, you may notice that there is no Australia. We're used to being forgotten at the bottom end of the world, but when we go back, have a look. Next time, let's put Australia on the mark. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I am one of the, I guess, people who've been to all of these, and I find these extremely valuable in both my archival education and in just making connections with the other people in the memory institutions. Now, you heard about the first 40 years of the archive. I will continue our story from 1994, which is when I became the archivist. I was in Estonian House one day when someone said to me, Raivo Kalamäe wants to speak to you. Now, everyone in Sydney knows that when Raivo Kalamäe wants to speak to you, it means work. So he tapped me on the shoulder and said, I would like you to become the archivist. And I thought, why not? How hard can it be? I'd been working with the university's second-hand book sale for 12 years, and I thought you just tidy up the books and sort out the papers, and that's it. Well, how wrong can you be? It wasn't like that at all. I spent a year lifting things from one place to the other and plaguing the university archivist for advice. And then I decided that I would go back to university and learn just a little bit about archives, just enough to get me by. Well, I think everybody here knows that once you start down this track, there is no stopping. It becomes addictive. You always want to do more. So in the end, I did a master's degree in information management so that I could handle this archival job properly. Dr. Salasoo left us a magnificent collection of books and materials, as you heard from Inno. But the problem was that they weren't sorted. He was a collector, and he collected this all. The books were on the shelves, but they weren't systematically on the shelves. And while he knew exactly where every book was, when I became the archivist, I didn't. And the archival records were in piles and quite intermittent, so really the material was not accessible. The personal papers, the organisational papers, were all together with everything else. And with a team of very enthusiastic volunteers, we set about making the work systematic and getting it to be accessible. We decided to change the archive and make it into 3 parts: the library, the archival records, and the artefacts. The books we arranged in a modified Dewey Decimal System because that was the system used in most Australian libraries. The personal papers we put into files, and we put the files in archive boxes labelled alphabetically. The organisational records we sorted by state and then within organisations in the states. Australia has, I think, 6 states and 2 territories, and most places have Estonian organisations. So we had a lot of records from a very large area because, as you all know, Australia is bigger than the whole of Europe put together, and our people live scattered everywhere. The photographs that Inno talked about, there were thousands of them, but unfortunately most of them had absolutely no information on them. And really a photograph of 3 men standing in a snowdrift, while maybe a lovely photograph, does not tell you anything about where it came from or who they were. We're still doing this work after 20 years, but we like to think that we've got a bit further. This is now where we're heading and what it looks like. On the right are what we call the personal papers, labelled alphabetically. And on the left are the personal papers, and on the right is our library, which is set up according to, as I said, the Dewey Decimal System. During the 20 years that I've been the archivist there, we've had about 20 volunteers. And we keep our volunteers quite a long time, and they stay until they can't climb the stairs to the room, or they can't climb ladders, or else they move away from Sydney. One of our volunteers has been working in the archive for more than 30 years, and several still come from 100 or 50 to 100 kilometres away from Sydney just to come and work in the archives as volunteers. In Australia, most of this sort of work is done on a voluntary basis. We work as a team, coming in 1 day a week, and everyone has their own area in which they work. We like to think that we're making good progress. We feel that we are the keepers of Estonian history in Australia, and we make that available to anyone who wants to visit the archive. Like all other archives, we are starting to face grave problems. I think it's a matter of time, but really, the three main problems for us are the security of tenure in Estonian House, the lack of space, which every archivist knows, and the decline in the bilingual abilities of our volunteers. The problem with tenure is that Estonian houses in Australia, which were bought or built by the post-World War migrants, are getting old, and they cost money. Also, the community that built those houses is dying or has already died, and the second and third generation people don't have that passion and need for being together with their countrymen. They've blended into the Australian community, and the activities in Estonian House are getting less and less. There are 3 Estonian houses in Australia, Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, and each one of them has problems with maintenance and charges. And with the government regulations on public halls, it's getting more and more expensive to keep the houses, but we have a smaller and smaller community that's supporting them. So every 10 years or so in Sydney, we have this discussion: what will we do? Will we sell? Will we knock it down and redevelop? Or will we stay put? And so far the decision has been to stay put, which has been good for the archive. Well, we're right in this process again, and we are looking at, do we sell and move? Do we knock it down and develop? Or do we stay and fix it up? No decision's been made. I think we're going to stay, but that needs money. And to have money, you need to rent out the rooms. And the more rooms you rent out, the less rooms there are for Estonians. So we're caught in a bit of a bind. With the lack of room, and we had to give up a stack, as Inno said, we have we have a archive room, which is a reasonable size. We share a workroom with other committees, and it really gets a bit tight. The stack that we had to give up because they wanted to rent out the room, and suddenly we had to get rid of lots and lots of books and journals and magazines. So we went back to the original principles, or one of the original principles for starting the archive, which was to keep material relating to the activities and achievements of Estonians in Australia. So we were lucky enough to get some money from the Compatriots Fund, and we bought out a library expert from Estonia. We looked at every book in the collection, and we decided whether we would keep it, whether we would send it to Estonia, or we would offer it to another institution. Luckily, we managed to have enough room to keep a very strong reference library. We keep all the books written by and about expatriate Estonians, and we keep, again, books written by or about Estonians in Australia. We offered our very extensive collection of newspapers to other memory institutions, and we got enthusiastic replies from them all, but nobody wanted 20 years run of one particular paper. They wanted number 5 from 1957 of this paper and number 6 to 9 of something else. Well, we were able to satisfy all their needs, but it took such a long time. With every request, we had to sort through all the papers, so I'm glad that bit has been done. We had an extensive sound and film collection, and with the help of the Compatriots Fund again, we were able to bring out an expert from Estonia to look at our record collection. It was gone through very thoroughly, and I am very pleased to say that we had records which were not in Australia, some of which they knew about but hadn't seen, and we actually had records that they didn't even know about. So these have been transported as hand luggage very carefully back to Estonia. It is a pity to get rid of your collection or deaccession because you don't get rid of it, but we really don't have the facilities for playing cassettes and looking after these very fragile records. So we're very pleased that they have now found a home where they will be looked after. The very large collection of ephemera, and I referred to that, was invitations, newspaper cuttings, tickets, flyers. They ran in the tens of thousands, and we hadn't been able to look at them at all up to now. But again, and I keep saying, thank you, Compatriots Fund, we were able to bring someone out to have a look at them, and we sorted through them all, divided them into two parts, the Australian part and the non-Australian part, and we have been able to send the non-Australian material to Estonia, to the Literary Museum, where I believe they are busily cataloguing and sorting them out. When we go through the Australian part, we will be able to take out all the duplicates and send them over too, but we are keeping anything that relates to us. People say to me, why don't you digitise? You'll have lots of room. Well, if I digitised our important documents, and that assumes we've had to choose what we really want to digitise, it wouldn't save any room because I'd have the digital copy, but I wouldn't throw the original away, so that doesn't save anything. And as really, we don't have the resources to do that at all. We don't have the time, we don't have the money. Now, we could do what the Australian Archives do. If I wanted a copy of my father's records held by the Australian Archive, they would digitise them for me for a fee, and it's quite a substantial fee, but then they would put them on the internet for everybody to see. Now, some people may want their records up, some people may not, but most of our records, we couldn't do that anyway because the Australian Copyright and Privacy Acts are very strong, and we don't have the paperwork from early depositors to say that we can actually do it. So we've decided that for us, the best thing is to create catalogues of the personal papers, catalogues of the organisational records, catalogues of the DP collection that we have, and put the catalogues up on the net so researchers can see what we hold without actually seeing the documents, and they can always get in touch with us and we can fax, scan, photograph, do whatever to give them access, because really accessibility is what it's all about. Our third big problem is with volunteers. There we all are. This is the current batch of volunteers. Yes, we're getting on a bit, but we are still very enthusiastic and very keen and very enthralled with our jobs. And while we will be there, things will go well. But the second and third generation Estonians in Australia, although they may speak Estonian, they certainly don't read Estonian. And while our records are coming increasingly in English, because if you are a registered organisation, you must have your minutes and your reports in English. And a lot of people who are writing their memoirs now write them in English because their children and grandchildren don't understand Estonian. We still have a huge number of records that are in Estonian, and we do need Estonian language skills to be able to work there. There are new Estonians, as we've talked about new and old Estonians. There are new Estonians in Australia, but most of them either work or are home with young children. And to be honest, they're not very keen on voluntary work. Australia is a country where volunteering is a way of life, but maybe we're a dying breed. But the young people expect to be paid, and we just don't have the facility to pay anybody to do this sort of work. I don't think anyone in the archive has ever been paid. And if we need work done, we have to rely on the Council of Australian Societies to fund us, or else the Compatriots Fund, because there is no one else. We need to find answers to these questions: the security of tenure, the space, the volunteers, the access. I think we're getting on well. I think we're slowly getting there. We have a lot of discussions with other ethnic archives in Australia, and they're all in the same boat. There has been an idea mooted that somebody, I presume the government, provide a central repository for the records of all the ethnic groups in Australia. But that's not really worthwhile, because if you put them in to a repository like that, there is no access. And if you can't access the documents, what's the point of keeping them? They're just sitting there. So these questions we struggle with daily, and I don't think we're the only ones that do. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from you here how you have dealt with similar questions, because I doubt very much if we're the only ones that are there. So here we are. You can see Estonian House. Those lovely windows up the top are actually where the archive is. And in the central picture, just to have a little brag, I'm the little girl in the check coat. This is a week after I arrived in Australia in May 1949, and that is the transit camp that people stayed in between arriving and going on to some other place. And of course, the picture on the bottom left-hand side is the pride and joy of the Estonians in Australia. It was when we hosted Esto 88. It was a wonderful occasion. People from all sorts of backgrounds and countries came, and Estonian was the only common language we had. So it was really an Estonian festival, and we hold the records of that, apart from the ones that I have already sent to the museum for their exhibition. So there we are, every Wednesday from 9 till 3. We are open for business. We are very happy to have visitors, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maija. So you are doing an extremely important work, and I really hope that the Compatriots Fund will keep on funding both you and the other archives who have been listed. Okay, questions?
Again from Australia. Come on, everybody, don't let her have it all.
I'm Dundon Smith from Australia. Would you like to share with us some stories of the people who have used the archives? I'm aware of 2 theses that have been written, one a bachelor's honours and another PhD, based on, at least in part, on material in the archives, but probably there are other people making scientific and creative use. Oh, I'm thinking also of a master's thesis on Estonian art in Australia. Probably there are others making scientific, academic, creative use. Could you tell us some of those stories?
Well, our archive is accessible and we're online, and I modestly say our reputation is worldwide, so people know what we have. And yes, we do get a lot of people. We get students from Sydney universities coming in if they're doing cultural or ethnic kind of jobs, and we have had several masters in, well, they're new subjects now. They're sort of economic, geography, political things, looking at the lives of migrants and where they are and how they achieve. A lot of people come in to look at our art collections and the information we have. And only 2 weeks ago, there was a Baltic art exhibition in the foyer of the Sydney House of Parliament, a very wonderful exhibition that was curated by an Estonian and a Latvian. And the Estonian came into the archive to find out who the Estonian artists were. And we have a collection of programs of all Estonian art exhibitions, or art exhibitions where there have been Estonian artists. We have a good collection. So she found those, and then there came the question, where are they? Well, unfortunately, many of them were dead. But we knew the relatives, and the actual person was a new Estonian, and she was astonished when she said, well, do you have information about this particular artist? And we said, oh, yes, she's my daughter's godmother, or she was somebody else's in-law. We could place the people and the art and put them in touch, and luckily we got a little acknowledgement. If you look at a lot of books written in Estonia by Estonians about the refugee experience, you often see a little citation of thanks to the Estonian archives in Australia. We do get a lot of Estonian authors coming to sort of look at our work. We have school children who come because they've been given a topic. They had to do an essay on art or music, and because they're of Estonian heritage, although they don't claim to be Estonian, they want to do it on Estonian music. So I say to them, all right, we do have this, but I don't have time to translate. Bring grandma. And they bring their grandmother along, and she will translate for them. But then we use grandmother to identify these photographs that we don't know, but we know that grandmother is about the age of the people in the photographs. And then she will come along another day with a friend and identify some more. We have quite a busy, high-level academic public that uses us, but we also have a younger public. And for me, that's wonderful. You want it to be a living source of information where people come. And we had 12 Korean students who were doing some kind of degree at the University of Technology, and they had been signed Estonia. They didn't even know where it was, but they'd seen Estonian House, so they happened to turn up on a Wednesday. Well, we gave them all the information about Estonia, too much, I think. We introduced them to our folk dancers, we introduced them to our singers, and about 2 months later, they turned up with 16 cakes, and a great thanks because they had got a distinction, which is in Estonian a 5, for their project, and it was the first 5 they had ever had. So it makes you feel quite good about yourself when you can help all sorts of people.
Some more questions.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and wish you all the luck in the future too. But could you provide some kind of a more context at how exceptional this is Estonian archives in Australia, that does the other immigrant groups have similar archives? And then that you mentioned the Australian Council of Societies or something.
Yes.
So do you get any funding, or how the Australian government or the New South Wales government has relations to the ethnic groups?
Well, we get no direct funding from the Australian government. When I say the Council of it's the Council of Estonian Societies in Australia that actually owns the archive. But we are able to apply for Australian government grants, and I have had Australian government grants. But Yuri and Anne will bear me up, but we have an extremely good reputation in Australia. We are the premier ethnic archive in Australia. And whenever a new ethnic community wants to start their archive and they go to either the National Archives or the National Library or the state libraries asking for help, they always get referred to us. So we've actually helped set up many an ethnic archive. And it's really sad, but most of the communities have left it too late, especially the post-war migrants. Most of the people who came are dead, and you're relying on the children. Some children know a lot about what is necessary and what isn't. But the big problem, and it's the same for us, is if the children don't read their mother tongue and their parents die, they have all these documents that they can't read. They don't know what the value is, and they throw them away. So the trick is to get to people before they die, or organisations before they close, so that you have a chance to get the records and then sort them out yourself. But the Croatian archives in Sydney are definitely one of our babies. We set them up from beginning. I spoke at fundraising functions to try and impress the Croatians to hand over money so that they could have an archive. We work closely with the Dutch because, and I will tell you my favourite story, because the first Estonians came to Australia on a Dutch ship in 1696. They were part of Willem de Vlaminck's Great Southland expedition, and there were 4 Estonian and Livonian sailors. And we do a lot of visits for interest groups who come to our archive, and I always tell them this story that the Estonians have always been the bottom of the pile. Ours have been the common sailors, not the captains. So our 4 Estonians rowed the boat from the ship to the shore. They jumped into the water, they pulled the boat up on the sand so that the officer wouldn't get his shoes wet, but we were there first. So 1696, the first Estonian feet on Australian soil. And I mean, we have them from everywhere. I've had people from the Chinese archives and the Indian archives. We're a good batch, just like this, but in Sydney. And we are the envy of all the other ethnic groups because of our archive. If that answers your question.
Okay, we have time for one more question. No, at the moment. Okay, thank you, Maya.
You will see no Australia in the bottom corner, so next time, please.
Okay. Our next speaker comes from the United States, and she will speak about the World War II refugees' heritage in Lakewood archives. So, Ave-Maria Pilte.
Hello, everybody. Let me get it set up here. Full screen. This is in Estonian, so computer talk for me. Oh, here we go. And then I just use the arrows. Okay. All right. Hello. My name is Ave. Brief introduction for those I have not met yet before, although I see very many familiar faces in the crowd. I was born and raised in Tallinn, Estonia, and arrived in the United States in 1990 when Estonia was still part of Soviet Union. So I consider myself an old, new American Estonian. There's very many layers of us, which I will go over in a minute. I've made my home in California, Texas, and Florida, but found a more familiar territory as for nature and actual four seasons on the East Coast. Fate has brought me together with an interesting group of Estonian World War II refugees, and now it has been already 5 years since I've been working as an archivist at the Estonian Archives in the United States, which lays in Lakewood, New Jersey. I am a photographer by profession, so I have mostly compiled some interesting photos from the archive. Also, as in Australia, first Estonians arrived in North America during the colonial era already, although it is factually a little bit hard to prove because at that time there was no Republic of Estonia or any kind of other legal entity bearing the name of Estonia. So the sailors that jumped ship were technically citizens of Empire of Russia or Kingdom of Sweden. And as I said, there are quite a few layers of how we label ourselves in America. There's the old Estonians, which means prior to World War II, the World War II DPs, Soviet dissidents, fortune seekers, and so on. Interesting photo I found in our collection was this photograph of an Estonian pub that was already in New York City in 1904. As you know, pubs are important to any culture as a meeting place. This one features a nice potbelly stove for warmth. The first wave of political refugees happened after 1905. The revolution of 1905 in Russia brought the first wave of Estonian political emigres to America. I made an enlargement of the club insignia on the left-hand corner saying Estonian Workers' Club with the hammer and sickle. Then came the Nazis. That's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but that's how a lot of times the World War II refugees are categorized by those who do not know the whole history behind them better. This is actually from a Sakala ball, this photograph. The reason why 14,000 or so Estonians went westward was self-evident. They had already suffered through the brutal year of Soviet rule in 1940 to 41, and rather than live under Stalinist repressions, they chose permanent exile. Many Estonians fleeing their homeland during World War II, most were, however, hoping to return home as soon as the war was over. Therefore, a lot of families left with only small suitcases containing bare essentials for a temporary trip. Towards the end of the war, Germany's defeat had become inevitable, and Estonians had to face the grim reality of Soviet Union illegally annexing Estonian territory, thus making many political asylum seekers in addition to war refugees. On the card, you can see an inscription on one of the panels saying Australia and single women. So I don't know if Maya, if you have that photo in your collections. I can share that with you. Single women and single mothers were the least desirable workforce, which I will go into later. So they actually had the hardest time finding placement in their new countries. Note the difference in expressions on those two photographs. While the man is devastated, perhaps worrying about the farmhouse that he had to leave behind, the children are laughing. They do not understand the severity of the circumstances yet, perhaps, and for them this is all just an interesting adventure. I have heard of many accounts where farmers especially refuse to leave, saying who would milk the cows. And if you know anything about farm life, you know it's not being greedy, but it's being compassionate, because if you don't milk the cow regularly, it causes them very great pain. The abrupt departure from Estonia is evident in this photo, where the gentlemen are wearing their coats and fancy hats to chop firewood, instead of being dressed in a more comfy lumberjack outfit. Besides basic necessities like a roof over their head and food rations, they were not really provided with anything else at the DP camps. DP, of course, is displaced persons. So for any extra things that they might need or desire, they had to set up shop themselves. Estonian families tried to make the best of their circumstances, from continuing to cook their ethnic foods from scarce rations, even building illegal stills to distill puskar, also known as moonshine. Morale was held high by leaders of the community, like Voldemar Päts here on the photo on the right-hand side, giving a speech. He was, of course, a younger brother of the then and first president of Estonia. Voldemar himself was an artist and an artisan who later emigrated to Canada. Of course, Estonians can't function without singing, so laulupeod were soon instituted, the song festivals. Those who had neglected to pack their fall costumes assembled them from donated military surplus and blankets or whatever materials were available. For example, instead of being able to weave a woolen traditional skirt of many colors, different color strips were just sewn on from yarn and so-called silver brooches hammered from soup can lids. As the saying goes, eestlane oskab ikka millestki saia teha. Estonians know how to make something from nothing. Schools of all ages and grade levels were also set up immediately, so children would not fall behind in their studies. Needless to say, textbooks in Estonian language were not readily available, so makeshift learning materials were typed in the camp office to the blank side of discarded paperwork. Most important, though, was to keep current with the news, as the progress of war would determine their fates and also the current foreign politics. Radio news were broadcast and then transcribed on steady basis, and then published in many newspapers or just notice boards for all to see in their native Estonian language. You can see just the multitude of different titles that continued to be published during those uncertain years right after World War II. Once it became obvious that the refuge was not so temporary, and returning to Estonia, which by now, of course, was illegally annexed by Soviet Union, was impossible. Many hoped to continue on to the United States, the land of the free that welcomes all huddled masses, the land where all is possible and the streets are paved in gold. As an unidentified U.S. general on the left-hand photo here is inspecting the camp and making sure that the ladies appreciated the blankets they had sent over. When I came across this photo with the general, it immediately reminded me of an interesting little fact. I'll see if you agree with that. On the right-hand side, you see James Norman Mattis, nicknamed Mad Dog Mattis, for his fierce approach to the art of war. He is a former United States Marine Corps general who served as 11th Commander of United States Central Command during the presidency of Barack Obama, and now continues his service as the current United States Secretary of Defense. I just found the similarity between those two gentlemen too uncanny. I had to insert this here, mostly for my own amusement. Speaking of having fun, kus sa ikka nalja saad, kui ise ei tee, is a famous Estonian saying. Translated, how else can you have fun if you don't joke around? The inscription behind this photo says, I'll translate it to English, some bachelors in Geislingen 1948. Including indulging in politically incorrect comedy. There is a common misconception that refugees could simply arrive in the USA whenever they felt like it after World War II. This myth is often stressed in the context of current migrant issues facing the Republic of Estonia now, of how we must accept European Union mandated quotas because we ourselves once were accepted with open arms also. In fact, one needed to fill out a lot of paperwork and prove an American sponsor was guaranteeing accommodations, living wages, in order to be granted admission. We have tens of thousands of these immigration papers from the Estonian Relief Committee, Eesti Abistamiskomitee collection, which lists the family names on this first panel, including all the minor children. The photos are attached. On the other side, you will see what languages they were speaking, what their skills were, and what type of work they were hoping to find. Very often you'll see somebody being a teacher or police captain or something quite very well educated, and the job they desire is farmer, factory worker, just anything. And the ladies during that era, many were, of course, just homemakers. So their skills were that she could become a seamstress or a housekeeper and so on. All applicants also had to pass a health check during the entire process that was called screening. Screening also meant that they were trying to weed out anybody that could be categorized as a war criminal so that they wouldn't slip through the cracks. For example, anyone testing positive for tuberculosis was not allowed to emigrate until they could produce a clean bill of health after completing treatment. The translation behind this photo says, one chap who successfully passed the screening got tipsy, drunk with happiness and certainly some puskar or moonshine. And now we come across the Atlantic. Seabrook Farms Company was started by Albert P. Seabrook in 1870. Among the agricultural firsts at Seabrook was the use of overhead irrigation and gasoline-powered tractors. In the early 1930s, they partnered with Clarence Birdseye and General Foods to quick freeze vegetables, which subsequently enabled Seabrook to become the first major produce supplier for the United States military. At one point, the company operated the largest processing plant of its kind, supplying 20% of the nation's packaged frozen food. Providing that kind of output requires a sizable workforce, and the need became especially acute during World War II. Migrant laborers and college students traditionally worked the fields during the summer, but many were called to war, leaving a severe labor shortage. Japanese Americans who'd been placed in internment camps at the start of the war were eventually permitted to move to other parts of the country for work, and many chose to try Seabrook. German prisoners of war held in nearby Senerton were also sent in as additional labor. Displaced Europeans from Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Hungary, and Germany also found their way to Cumberland County and then to the farm. During the 1940s and 50s, 32 different ethnicities were represented within Seabrook's workforce, with more than 20 languages being spoken around the farm. I think it's a Pontiac, correct me if I'm wrong. Many Estonian men also found employment in construction and even started their own construction companies, as that was the fastest way to make the most money. This enabled them in turn to hire more Estonians that were arriving later. A common saying of any idiot can put a brick on top of another brick, but it actually takes brains and skill to be a carpenter, illustrates the friendly ribbing between bricklayers and carpenters. But they both donated their time, skill, and resources to build the Estonian House, the archive building, and the church in Lakewood. Estonians assimilated into local life quite well, as many, especially younger folk, learned English quickly, and they went to regular local high schools. And for example, in Lakewood High School, especially the Estonian guys were very popular, both with American girls and Estonian girls, because they were all tall and blonde and great athletes, winning lots of trophies for the high school. One more little interesting tidbit from my colleague at the archive, who most of them all are DPs coming through Augsburg and Geislingen, so I hear a lot of oral history every Monday that we work there together. Her father was a police captain in Estonia, and of course sported a very fancy mustache, as was the fashion back then. In Seabrook and in Lakewood area, he found employment in a chicken farm. As an egg layers owner myself, I can vouch that next to pigs, hens are indeed the smelliest farm animals. So by the second day, his father had to shave his mustache because the stench of the chicken coop was not something that he could live with, and thus he lost his fancy mustache. One lady who deserves a special mention in my mind is Helena Clayton and her one-woman crusade on behalf of DPs. She used to work at the Estonian Foreign Office in Estonia and married an American journalist, John Clayton, in 1920. They came to America, settling in Chicago, where John worked his way up to become an advertising executive. They had 2 sons. When World War II started, John Clayton volunteered for the Air Force. Their sons, also now in their 20s, one became a B-29 pilot and the other a B-17 navigator, who was killed in a raid over France. Helena became involved with Estonian Relief Commission, Eesti Abistamiskomitee. As I indicated, arriving Estonians needed local sponsors, people who would provide them with a place to live and any job available. Helena Clayton's attitude and chutzpah is summed up in this August 6, 1950 Parade magazine interview by Arthur Shea. And I quote, "Look," Helena said, "you want to write the magazine article about me and all the DPs I brought to this country. You're going to have to type the copy for your editor. How would you like to have a nice Estonian girl help you? She types 50 words per minute." This can-do attitude is indicative of many newcomers who knew they had to rely on their own wits to make a new start. The Honorary Consul General of Estonia in Canada, Lars Leivat, has declared that his uncle settled in Lakewood already in the early 20s. Many Estonians settled there in the 30s, almost exclusively from New York City, where an active community had already formed. A young newlywed couple, Konstantin and Marta Laht, in 1933, played a significant role in community history, having donated the land where the current Estonian house still stands. The Estonian refugees demonstrated great self-reliance and spirit of entrepreneurship. This extended from poultry farms established in the 30s to 3 pubs owned by Estonians in the 40s and 50s. The community feeling among Lakewood Estonians has expressed itself via the economic high achievers giving back to the community. The Estonian clubhouse was completed in 1947. As the number of Estonians eventually increased to thousands, additions to the building had to be made in the 1970s to accommodate larger gatherings and theater productions. And this is the nearest and dearest to my heart. The need to archive important documents, especially as pertaining to legal immigration issues, emerged already in the DP camps in the 1950s. And the actual establishment of the Estonian archives in the United States took more time. The materials of the Gaisling and DP camp laid foundation to the collections of the archives. The founding meeting was held on June 27, 1969. In 1972, the building specially constructed for the archive was festively inaugurated. And again, all the materials and the labor was donated from the Estonian community, and the Estonians themselves built it with their skill. The archives actually moved into the building in September 1975. On the lower right-hand corner, right by the door, the open door, you can see founder Ferdinand Kool. Of course, we can't quite compare with the Estonian House in New York City. The Bow Art Building originates from 1899 and lies on 243 East 34th Street, 4 blocks away from the iconic Empire State Building. The New York Estonian Educational Society was born on December 7, 1929. The name, including the word educational, was created in order to minimize tax implications of a private sale. The 25-square-mile town has the largest yeshiva, which means an Orthodox Jewish seminary or college to train future rabbis, in the world. Beth Medrash Gavoha is official name. The population has now exceeded 100,000 people, making a once tiny village the 8th largest town in New Jersey, which is quite evident during the gridlock traffic at rush hour. However, driving is a breeze on Saturdays when it's Sabbath and they are not allowed to drive. This press photo depicts a handful of the circa 10,000 mourners that attended the funeral of Rebbetzin Reshe Kotler on Sunday, July 20 in 2015. She was the wife of Rabbi Shneur Kotler, the former dean of Beth Madrash Gavoha. Prior to 1930, there were 27 old Estonian families in Lakewood. After World War II, the arriving DPs increased the Estonian population to 578 families. Figuring that a typical family consists of at least 3 people, 3 times 578 is 1,734. So I think it's safe to say that in its heyday, there were about 2,000 Estonians living in Lakewood. The heyday of Estonian expatriate activity in this diaspora was the 60s and 70s, with many choirs, sports associations, folk dance groups, etc. But with the changing demographics, the number of Estonian households remaining in Lakewood has fallen to 5 in 2018. So from 578 to 5. This is our current team of volunteers. This photo was taken at last Christmas luncheon. As you see, there are more than 5 people on the photo, luckily. I, for instance, was behind the camera. Well, actually, a smartphone. This is due to the fact that some of our dedicated volunteers drive here from surrounding areas like New York, Princeton, etc. My own commute, for example, from further down in South Jersey is 4 hours round trip, or about the same as Tallinn to Tartu. But we do what we can, and we thank all who continue to support us, including Compatriots Program. As for New Blood, we face the same issues as Maya Barrow so eloquently spoke about. The newcomers simply cannot afford to volunteer. When you are a new person in a new country, all your time goes to perhaps working full-time, studying full-time, sometimes both. So I've been trying to recruit some newer blood, but I remain hopeful. As for facts and figures about the archive itself, we have about 145 meters of shelf space for small prints and magazines and newspapers, over 1,600 titles of paintings, drawings, and sculptures. Out in the showcases, we have 1,199 war medals and insignia. And then there's tons more of sports awards and scout badges in the storage. The library has about 7,000 titles. We also use duodecimal system to make sense of them. We also have a lot of rare books from Geislingen, like I mentioned, a lot of textbooks were hand-printed or handwritten on recycled paper and then hand-bound. 90 linear feet of photograph boxes, and one box may have 6 photos in it, the other one might have 600, depending on the size of the box and the topic. In addition to all that, about 2,000 videotapes, VHS tapes, sound cassettes, CDs, vinyls, including home movies and oral history. And we keep adding, especially to the church collection. The church territory that the building lies on is the Holy Ghost Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church. The documents from private persons reach into tens of thousands of units. They can include anything from documents as like birth certificate to passports to school diplomas, a lot of correspondence, a lot of memoirs. And we also, in the library section, we also have a lot of original manuscripts, dissertations, translations. A lot of people have taken upon themselves to translate well-known Estonian authors' works into English or vice versa. So we also keep those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And yeah.
Oops, what did I do?
I would like my name is Markus Felke, by the way, from Germany. I would like to know, you talked about wartime criminals from Estonia and the so-called Nazi refugees. And I would like to know if you have any evidence how many wartime criminals have been detected after they came to the US. And I would like to know whether you have any evidence about German Baltics who declared to be Estonians and who have come to the USA as Estonian DPs. Thank you.
I don't have any exact figures. Like I said, during the screening process, the refugees were asked about their involvement in the German army. So I doubt that very many were able to even reach United States unless they blatantly denounced their history or, came here under fake names. As for Baltic Estonians, we don't have like a separate category for that in Lakewood for baltisakslased. I think it's kind of a new territory for most diaspora archives in general.
Ma ei tea, kas te saate vastata mulle. Ma olen kuulnud, et Lakewoodi arhiivist viidi palju materjali Minneapolise ülikooli hoidlatesse. Kas te võiksite natuke selle kohta rääkida?
The question was about transferring some of our materials to Minneapolis, Minnesota. That is true. In the University of Minnesota, there is an Immigration History Research Center, which is an organization that we collaborate with. Due to the lack of space, simply, and through a substantial grant from Estonian expatriate community, a special little collection was started there where we could send some of our materials. Unfortunately, dealing with only volunteers, this happened, was it like maybe 6-7 years ago, something like 10 years ago? Was before my time. Some of the collections, unfortunately, ended up, let's say, 8 boxes in Minnesota and 2 are still in Lakewood. So it was kind of a haphazard move. But they are searchable. They have not digitized, but at least the list of what items they have in Minnesota is viewable through their website. And on our records in Lakewood, we have a notation after each name or collection box title, whether physically it's still in Lakewood or has it been sent to Minnesota. By the way, the Immigration History Research Center collects materials for all ethnic groups that wish to be housed there. I think there are about like 200 ethnicities right now. And Estonia is the 5th largest. So they say, please don't send us anything anymore. We have enough.
Some more questions or comments?
In Lakewood, it wasn't just a matter of not having enough room, but it was also that in Minnesota, we knew that the archives that were sent there would stay there forever. In terms of how long it's going to keep going in Lakewood, we don't know, because most of the people are elderly who are volunteering there, and you can't really tell how long we'll keep going there. So that was like main reason for having it there. And I think we sent as much as we could. I think they had a certain limit at that point, like, okay, we can't take any more, we have this much room.
That's correct. And I think the priority was given to the collections dealing with Estonian organizations. That's why currently in Lakewood, we have mostly the archival documents pertain to private persons, like isikukogud. But files concerning different American Estonian organizations, they were mostly sent on to Minnesota.
I thought quite a few individual ones were sent there also.
They had to be notables.
Yeah, okay. I want to make another comment that in terms of coming from Germany to the US or Canada, it wasn't only that you had to go through a lot of paperwork and screening, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of times you still weren't accepted. The family members may have been all healthy and everything was fine, but you couldn't get here. I know personally, my uncle's family tried to come to the United States also, because both of his sisters were coming here. And he tried and couldn't make it. Then tried for Canada, wasn't accepted. And eventually then was accepted in Australia and went there.
That's true. Yep.
Just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ave Maria.
Thank you.
And in the end of this session, we are having Piret Nooreni to speak about VEMU, or Väliseesti Museum, in Toronto. And Piret is just newly re-elected president of the Baltic Heritage Network, so this morning.
Thank you, dear friends. So, hello, dear colleagues. As many of you already know, I've been working in Toronto for the Museum of Estonians Abroad, VEMU, almost 9 years now. And I will talk about VEMU's story, or how to become a museum, because we started, as the previous speakers told you already, as an archive and a library. So every museum should ask itself, but not only itself, why it exists and what is its purpose. So I ask, why do we need a Museum of Estonians Abroad in Toronto? Half jokingly, one could say that why not, if the opportunity exists? The real reason, of course, is that Canadian Estonians deserve their own museum, and more broadly, all Estonians deserve it, so we can tell our story far from the homeland in one of the largest communities of Estonians abroad and one of the most multicultural cities. But why is this museum possible in Toronto specifically? The VEMU idea was born by the Canadian-Estonian architect, property developer, and philanthropist Elmar Tampõld. VEMU, as the permanent depository of Canadian-Estonian archives and publication collections in downtown Toronto at Tartu College, would become a monument to Canadian-Estonian cultural sustainability. This was Tampõld's wish, who also was a long-time president of Tartu College. What are the requirements for this to be possible? The first is, of course, Tartu College, a successful Estonian business endeavor, a not-for-profit institution, an 18-floor student residence with a sizable income, able to support the development of VEMU and its archival and cultural programs. Tartu College is also home to Estonian academic organizations, fraternities and sororities, as well as many societies. Soon after the construction of the building in the fall of 1970, in 1971, Tartu Institute was created, leading to the collection of archival materials and publications. The second prerequisite for VEMU is the historical collections of Enda Laruja's library and archives, along with the later established Lending Library or Estonian Studies Library, and that's the library with a guest from Estonia, from National Archives, as long as other groups which are the Bibliography Club, the club of group of volunteers working for the archives and library. Then Estonian Heritage Society, which was filming interviews with Estonians about their life history and recorded events that took place in Toronto. They closed down their activities last year. Then we have two groups of life story writers, elulugude kirjutajad, and this is a group founded by Professor Tiina Kirs, the group working in Estonian language, and later there was started a group by Kaja Telmet, which works in English because they are younger community members who are not able to write their stories in Estonian anymore. And we also have two clubs, book clubs, first one working in English and another in Estonian. Okay, back here. So currently the umbrella organization for all these groups is the registered charity Estonian Studies Center, which was founded in 2009, from which the two Vemu Collections program and cultural program make up the museum. The Vemu collections are located in the lower garage level of Tartu College in the 7,000 square foot storage area. Our main goal, and we have a guest from Australia, a guy with a Greek background working on the book about Estonians living in Australia. The Vemu collections are located in the garage, as I said, and our main goal is to collect everything that is associated with Canadian Estonians. But throughout the collection process, we also consider the larger historical picture. The new three-story Vemu building, for which we have already had the plans and building license for a number of years, will be built beside Tartu College as an addition. We are collecting support from the Canadian Estonian community to build our new Vemu. Currently, we have received about 800,000 Canadian dollars. In association with the new Estonian Center that is going to build beside the Tartu College and replace the current Estonian house located on Broadview Avenue, heated discussions have taken place between those in favor of moving and those against. As of today, a decision to move has been made. Unfortunately, as a result of all the commotion, the topic of building Vemu has become hidden in the shadows. We have to hope that it will still be built because from the perspective of museum development, it is unavoidable. Although we do not yet have our new home, we do have growing collections and a developing culture program. The collections are expanding quickly. Every year we receive about 100 larger and smaller donations into our regular collections, which are documents, photos, audio and video material, and books, newspapers, and magazines for the library. Over the last few years, we have also directed our focus on growing our art and artifact collections for the museum. Among these collections, one can find national costumes and other ethnographic items, Estonian-themed souvenirs, memorabilia, suitcases, of course, brought with people during their flight from the homeland, and much more. We even have a model of a refugee boat, the schooner named Manni, upon which refugees fled from Kihnu Island in the fall of 1944. One of the refugees, Leida Sepp, who was 5 years old at the time, explains her story beautifully in an interview along with the photos and other materials. At the request of the Estonian Central Council in Canada, we will move collections of the Estonian Central Archives in Canada soon from the Estonian House to Tartu College. In this May, Tiiu and Sven from the National Archives, from Estonian National Archives, did a lot of work with these collections, which are a few years older than the Tartu Institute archives. As a result of their expertise and quick work, we were able to get an overview of the archival collections, have them repacked, described, and made ready for the move. But here you can see our guest in Tartu College at the Vemu Archives depository rooms. When I came to work to Toronto from Estonia in 2009, I had some specific plans in mind. To make sure the collections became used more actively, which required making all related information more accessible, and to advertise the collections. To move in this direction, we created a WEMU website, printed brochures, and also introduced a web-based database. This database was created by us was created for us by the Estonian National Archives a couple of years ago, and we also got, of course, support from the Compatriots program for that. I also wished to start a diverse cultural and academic program at WEMU. As I had worked in Tartu at the Estonian Literary Museum for almost 20 years, I had gotten used to constantly explain why collecting old papers is important. Understandably, historians do not need such explanations. However, state officials and donors do. A community archive and museum, which WEMU is, must constantly be reminding the whole community why it is important, so that the people who do not otherwise have any association with archives and museums work will provide both financial and moral support for the construction of a new building. The reminder also functions as a way of keeping people aware of the potential historical value of their possessions and to donate them to the museum. How do museums and memory institutions advertise themselves? By making use of media channels, of course, and social media platforms through announcements and sending invitations to events, but also through programming and initiatives. WEMU has access to a technologically well-equipped hall at Tartu College, as well as the lobby and hallways surrounding it, which has become one of the most active meeting places for Toronto Estonians. From the fall to spring, there is rarely a single week that we don't have at least one cultural event. Historical programs, exhibitions, lectures, seminars, book releases, and film screenings are the most important events for a museum. Through such programs, we tell the stories of Canadian Estonians, not just for ourselves, but to other nationalities in Canada, and of course to Estonia. It is just as important to address broader topics of Estonian history. Tying history to current political and cultural events is a natural and inevitable process, which we try to keep in mind when planning our program. For this reason, when putting together our programs, we have tried to follow the themes that are announced for every year in Estonia. So we have celebrated the Year of the Sea Culture, the Year of Children and Youth Culture, as well as the Year of European Culture Heritage this year. A modern memory institution has a number of other diverse functions, especially when located in a relatively small diaspora so far from Estonia. WEMU attempts to be a cultural diplomat of sorts, where we can bring together Estonians living in diaspora and in the homeland along with their cultures. Additionally, WEMU should help to promote Estonia in Canada. This all requires close-knit collaboration on many fronts. We have a number of partners in the form of Estonian organizations in Canada and the US, and cultural and memory institutions in Estonia and Canada. Since the fall of 2014, we have been associated member of the Bloor Street Culture Corridor. Currently, 29 different organizations belong to the BCC, including the Royal Ontario Museum, the Royal Conservatory of Music, Hot Dog Cinema, and many others. Over the last 4 years, we have collaborated with other Canadian Baltic groups, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Baltic Germans under the working group umbrella of Baltic Canadian Imprint. Now I will discuss our exhibition program in more detail. We do not yet have a new museum, with a friendly space for a permanent exhibition. But currently we attempt to provide a wide range of knowledge and experience with our temporary exhibits. Some years ago, we held public discussion to find out what Canadian Estonians would like to see as VEMO's permanent exhibition. Our work with temporary exhibition is preparing us for that time. We are testing out different topics, discovering our limitations, and trying different models of collaboration. Following are some examples of our exhibits. The first VEMO exhibition was opened in September 2010 when we celebrated Tartu College's 40th birthday. The exhibition was an overview of the history of Tartu College and its organizations. It was a great opportunity to learn about the community. I became more familiar with the people, with their positions in the community, their habits and ways of getting things done. And I was working with volunteers. It quickly became clear to me that working with volunteers is very different from working with professionals, paid employees. The hallway gallery, including the lobby of the Tartu College ground floor, has since been in constant use as an exhibition place. As soon as one exhibition is taken off the walls, a new one is put in its place. We have usually 4 to 5 exhibitions every year. In the beginning, most have been traveling exhibitions from Estonia, but also some from Canada. Currently, most of the exhibits have been curated and completed at VEMO, often in collaboration with one of our Canadian or Estonian partners. We complement our exhibitions with additional programming, conferences, lectures, film screenings, and sometimes even theater performances. For example, at the opening of the exhibition Estonians in Siberia in September 2011, Dr. Raimar Aag from Uppsala University gave the first Dr. Vello Soots Memorial Lecture on the topic Emigration of Estonians Through the Ages. Dr. Vello Soots Memorial Lectures, by the way, are one of our traditions, like traditional lecture series. The exhibition was created by the Estonian Literary Museum and the Estonian Academy of Arts. We prepared a theater performance based on the life stories book written by a researcher of the Estonian Folklore Archives, Anu Korb, who was also one of the authors of the exhibition. The performance was done by Ilutuli Theatre and titled The Lives and Stories of Estonians in Siberia. We also screened a film about Estonians in Siberia, Võõra maade sees, a documentary by Andres Korjus at the Toronto Estonian Supplementary School, with whom we very often share our program. Anu herself was present, and as she is well acquainted with Siberian Estonians, she was able to speak her way into the hearts of Toronto Estonians. After the event, a number of Toronto Estonians came to me to say that they had never learned so much about Estonians living in Siberia up until that point. What was especially surprising to them was that the experience of being and living as an Estonian far from the homeland was very similar. Siberian Estonians traveled from Toronto to the Immigration History Research Center in Minneapolis, and after arriving back to Canada was exhibited at the Roberts Library of the University of Toronto. We do not always have, that's at the library in Toronto, the exhibit. We do not always have to rely on archival sources to speak about history and what it means to be Estonian. We have had pleasure of preserving the work of Canadian Estonian artists, and I'll talk about 2 of them. And both of those collections, or the exhibits, tell the story of being Estonian in their own way. And the well-known Estonian author Arvet Virlaid's granddaughter, who lives in Vancouver, Jessie Anneli Virlaid-McNeil's collage exhibition Outsider Inside, a collage series of the Estonian Song and Dance Festival 2014, takes us back to the 2014 Song and Dance Festival in Tallinn. The series explores the perspective of a young Canadian Estonian during the festival from moments of mundanity to emotional highs. While expressing themes of memory and experience, Jessie Anneli collages pose the complex question, what is an Estonian today? The exhibit was later also displayed at some places in Estonia. Arne Roosman from Bancroft, Ontario, is a lithographer, designer of books, stage sets, and murals, as well as an illustrator and painter. His touch of arsenic sketching the past was a retrospective of Arne's childhood. He fled Estonia in 1941 with his parents and 7 brothers and sisters to Germany, where they stayed throughout the war. Arne tells his story through pictures in the form of an exhibition. The story has now also been published as a book, both in Estonian and English. And Arne, by the way, is also an author of the murals, which you can see on the walls of Tartu College when you come visit us. And those murals tell a story of Estonian cultural history. Eha Komissarov and Ellu Maar, art historians from the Kumu Art Museum, came to Toronto to get acquainted with Vello Muikma's inheritance. Muikma was a professional photographer. In addition to sorting the archives, they found some of Muikma's colleagues and students. He was teaching photography at OCAD, and put together an overview exhibition of Muikma's work. This exhibition has since become under the careful watch of Ellu Maar, a book which was published in 2016, and you can buy this book from Estonian bookstores. Convincing partners to collaborate with us has not been too hard, and I already told you the story about this exhibit, which we opened at the first day of the conference, so I would not go into details with that, but that's for sure is one of our biggest exhibition projects we have been working on. In 2016, another collaborative project was completed, the story of the Baltic University, Adventure and Struggle. Helga Merits completed a documentary about the Baltic University, and she also used our archival photos and also received a substantial financial support actually from the Estonian Studies Center. And it was quite natural for a collaborative exhibition of historical photos to be put together, providing an overview of the short-lived but long-lasting imprint of the Baltic University. The photos were accompanied by Helga's short descriptions, and Helga was present at the opening of the exhibition and the conference dedicated to the 70th anniversary of the Baltic University. An exhibition about Roman Toi, a Canadian-Estonian choir director and a composer who celebrated his 100th birthday in 2016, was made in collaboration with the young curators at the Estonian Theatre and Music Museum. This exhibition had many purposes. To celebrate Roman Toi, of course, but in addition to the young curators in Estonia learning extensively about Estonian music history abroad and the history of Estonians abroad overall, we digitized Roman Toi's scrapbooks at Vemu before sending them to Estonia. Every new exhibition has pushed us to organize, describe, and digitize our collections and add to them with new material. This was also the case with this exhibition. The exhibition was opened in both Toronto and Tallinn at the same time to celebrate the maestro's birthday together. The process of filming a documentary about Roman Toi, director Kalli Paakspuu from Toronto, took place simultaneously with the curation of the exhibition. This spring, Roman Toi left us right before his 22nd birthday, but Kalli's film should be completed in fall this year. We have organized a number of joint events and created the exhibit Sharing Our Stories, the Baltic Diaspora at Home in Canada, with the Baltic Canadian Imprint Group. There you can see the Lithuanian member of our group, Danny Breen, from the Lithuanian Museum Archives in Toronto, Mississauga, with one of the community members. The exhibit presents 30 panels holding the stories of Canadian Balts from their time in the Baltic countries up until they started their new lives in Canada. The exhibit has been on display in all of the Toronto Baltic Community Centres, but also in Ottawa and London, Ontario. The exhibit has received a lot of positive feedback for the reason that all of the stories are presented in parallel with one another. The fate of Baltic Germans after Umsiedlung has been especially eye-opening to other Balts. The exhibit is based primarily on oral history in the form of interviews, which all of the communities conducted among their community members. Relevant archival material was also collected for the exhibit. In the fall of 2017, we opened an exhibit about Estonian architects in Canada in collaboration with the Estonian Architecture Museum. The curator Jarmo Kauge visited Toronto twice and did great work not only in the Estonian archives and with the community members in Toronto, but also in Canadian memory institutions and architectural communities. The result was a thorough and professional insight into Canadian architectural history, to which Estonian architects have made remarkable contributions. The expanded version of the exhibit was on display in Tallinn, and that's a picture from this Tallinn version at the Estonian Architecture Museum this May. An exhibit catalogue is also in the process of being published, and I have to say that has probably been the most internationally popular exhibit, or the exhibit which got more interest from the Canadian larger public, because that's a part of the Toronto history. The architecture exhibit is one of our gifts to Canada for 150th birthday and Estonian centennial. This past spring, Rakvere Theatre opened the production Lahus, which was commissioned by Vemu and written by Liisi Rohumäe from Estonia. The play discusses Canadian Estonians and their relationships with their homeland. The play will be performed in Toronto this September when we host the Baltic 100 week. And as you can see, it takes place at the archival depository rooms. That's the first play about Vemu archives. And maybe about any Estonian archives. I haven't heard about any other play talking about or the activities we'll have in the archives, right? Then another birthday gift were the joint photo exhibits, Two Edges of the Lifespan, which were opened in February this year. The photos by the young Canadian-Estonian anthropologist Kristen Dobbin documented the activities of the younger members of the Canadian-Estonian community at the Jõekäru children's camp located in northern Ontario. And Thomas Volkmann's well-known photographer in Estonia, photos featured the older Estonian community members living in Ehadare, an Estonian retirement home in Toronto. Music connects people. Estonians are a small population with a large music culture. So in May we held our first Estonian Music Week in Toronto. Over the course of 6 days, almost 50 musicians from Estonia, the US, Finland, Norway, and Germany performed with about 20 Canadians, many of which had Estonian heritage. Vemu's largest and most expensive endeavor was a success. It brought together a large number of Estonians, but also made a mark in Toronto's rich and diverse cultural landscape. Thanks to the Bloor Street Culture Corridor, we have made many beneficial contacts among other cultural institutions located along Toronto's main street, which offered us opportunities for better venues, stages, and more widespread distribution of information. Music Week was one of the largest events included in the official program for the Estonia 100 in North America. This is most likely the reason why the Estonian Prime Minister, Jüri Ratas, planned his Canadian business trip to happen during the week. And here you can see him with the most well-known Estonian pop artist, Kerli, who also visited Toronto at the time. In addition to the concerts, we held a seminar, Estonia Meets Canada, where representatives of the Canadian and Estonian music industry discussed future opportunities for collaboration in the creative economy field. And you may ask why the music festival, we are the museum, but as I said, we are actually a cultural center. And as a museum, we of course opened 2 new exhibits for that occasion, both dedicated to Arvo Pärt. First one was Tõnu Tormi's photo exhibit on Pärt, and another one made by Estonian Theatre and Music Museum and Arvo Pärt's center, Arvo Pärt Renowned and Unknown. The latter was also on display during the week at the Royal Conservatory's Körner Hall during the Vox Clamantis and Maarja Nuut concert. This concert was also a part of the program of the Royal Conservatory's 21st Music Festival. As I mentioned earlier, in addition to the exhibitions, we also put together many historically themed events. We have hosted the Vemu Jane's Walks, which are like walks in Toronto where people tell the stories about the city. We have introduced the buildings designed by Estonians in downtown Toronto, and also the partner organizations of the Bloor Street Culture Corridor and the history of their buildings. Prime Minister Ratas also participated in a similar cultural walk during his time in Toronto. And one of the most popular events have been our cooking shows, of course. Food is popular, where we have prepared our grandmother's foods. And here you can see about 80 Estonians who showed up with their rolling pins to make traditional Estonian kringel. Even stand-up comedies can successfully discuss the Canadian-Estonian history. Andy Valvur drew almost 200 people to Tartu College to laugh about the weird aspects of being Estonian. The role of museums today is very diverse. Museums are faced with the task of collecting and teaching history to ensure the continuity of memory. But the museum as a living cultural organism must also be capable of speaking to the present by always creating new content, which will hopefully one day also be considered history worth remembering. Thus, I wish all the museum workers, but also to all the archivists, the strength and perseverance for thinking of new and creative ideas. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Piret. So as time is up by now, let's leave all the short and long questions to the lunch table. And let's gather back here in the hall at 2 o'clock. But now I think that lunch is already there in the restaurant. So let's enjoy.